Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about what could be called my theory of infinite potentiality. Um, it's, as you can probably notice, it's a nice peaceful night out, um, in a familiar area that I haven't been to in a while. But it's definitely a very relaxing area, especially on such a peaceful night. But anyway, I want to talk about my idea of infinite potentialities, and to do that, I need to lay some background. Um, about some background that's going to help support my idea of infinite potentialities. Which, by the way, the idea of infinite potentiality is a very psychological conception, and it deals a lot with the mind. And so, yeah, so just kind of something to think about. Um, so I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to talk about a theory that's going to lay the groundwork for kind of the main point that I'm going to get at, which is the infinite potentialities. So, so I don't know if you know much about quantum mechanics or the multiverse. They're very interesting theories about quantum mechanics and the multiverse. They're basically on the opposite ends of the spectrum, about as opposite as you can get, because the multiverse deals with everything that exists in all existence, from the huge, from the macro scale, so thinking about multiple universes. While in quantum mechanics, we think about the very small, so we think about the smallest quantum particles. And I think all of this is interesting. So all you really need to know about the multiverse for my intents and purposes is the idea that um, uh, so it's basically the idea of multiple universes, as you can imagine. And the idea is that each of these universes could potentially have their own set, their own laws of physics, um, which I um, which I think is super important to keep in mind. And so essentially, if it's a multiverse, universes that go on for all infinity, with infinite possibilities, essentially what you get is the idea of you get universes with um, an infinite set. How do I say this? With You get universes with differing laws of physics, and that basically goes on ad infinitum. Now, in terms of so just keep that in mind for the conception of infinity. So then, there's also in quantum mechanics the idea of superposition, and superposition is a very interesting conception. Um, they say that quantum particles don't exist in space. Well, they exist. Well, they exist, but they exist in more like probabilities, or they exist in states of possibility, rather than having their own velocity or their own momentum. I think those are the terms that are often used, or position, probably position. Yeah, position and velocity. So basically, these quantum particles are existing all over the place. So a classic example that's used is an orange. So an orange can be in one place, it can be in another place, it can be in another place, and the orange is supposed to represent a quantum particle, and it can be in all of those places at once. And the trick is knowing where it is, and the whole point is that we can't necessarily know where it is. Now, I want to say this doesn't imply that human beings could potentially be in a superposition where they're essentially everywhere. I think that's something to keep in mind. It depends on how you interpret quantum mechanics, but it does indeed have bizarre implications no matter how you interpret it, because it's saying that a quantum particle can be in multiple states of possibility at once. So I hope with all of this you're getting an idea of a pattern that's emerging, and the pattern is this idea of infinity, and more specifically the idea of infinite possibilities. Now, I want to lay the groundwork for a theory that I've been thinking about a lot lately, that's featured in my book right now that I'm writing, In Defense of the Mind. And the theory goes something like this. There's three realms of existence. There's plenty of realms of existence, but for my intents and purposes, I'm going to focus on three. There's the physical world, there's the cultural world, and then there's the mental world. Now, the physical world seems pretty cut and dry. So when you knock on a table, the table's pretty solid. Your hand's not going to go through the table is just there. Potentially you can manipulate the table by moving it. You can manipulate the objects on the table by moving the objects. So you can do all of that, but the physical world is pretty solid. It's pretty substantial and it's not changing. So if you get hit by a car, obviously that is that, and you were hit by a physical object, and you can't just think your way out of that predicament because the physical world is a very, very real realm. And so think about that in terms of limitation, and the limitations that we have in this physical world. So again, we might be able to manipulate these objects and the like in the physical world, but it's not as easy as it would seem. Then there's the cultural world. Now, I'm pretty reluctant to use the term cultural relativism, specifically the idea that our behavior is culturally determined, but I think there's some truth to it, at least in my case. There's a great idea that essentially society is run by the masses, and there seems to be a lot of truth to this because society does rule a lot of who we are and who we can be, and I think that that's something that we definitely take for granted sometimes. So these are the two assumptions: that the physical world is set, pretty set in stone, and that we live in a culturally deterministic world. And so, as you'll remember, the third part of this theory that I mentioned is that of the mind. And so the mind is an interesting thing. So everything at this point would fall on the mind, right? Because the mind has to perceive the physical objects, and the mind has to perceive how it fits into society. And I think all of that is super crucial to keep in mind. And kind of, so as you can tell, if we are culturally determined and the physical world does control a lot about ourselves, then that puts a lot of pressure on the mind. But I think that that's good in a sense, because then that allows the mind to essentially conceive of as many possibilities as it wants. And this is when I finally get to my idea of infinite potentialities, which is exactly what I just said, which is the idea that the mind can conceive of anything and use that to shape reality. Now, all of this is very difficult to wrap our head around. There's a lot of people that would say, how much control do we have over our mind? So there's a famous idea in psychology, specifically psychological determinism, that says that we're actually not really in control of our decisions because we're not conscious of our decisions. So we make the decision first before we're conscious of the decision, and then we become conscious of the decision. So essentially, we're not even in control of making the decision, at least in that model. But I'm not worried about any of those ideas. What I am worried about is thinking about this idea of infinite potentiality, how it deals with the mind. So remember, I was thinking of the multiverse and how essentially it's an infinite set of universes with each with their own laws of physics that goes on ad infinitum. And then we also think of the quantum particle and quantum mechanics, where the particle is in a superposition and is basically occupying a whole bunch of possibilities at once. And I think that that's super crucial. So how does this relate to the mind? Well, this is where I think that it's tricky. I think that it's tricky because the mind has a lot of limitations. Obviously, it can't just act on any of its ideas, but and obviously we can't act out on multiple decisions at one point. So we're bound by a decision that we make. But the reason why I'm so fascinated by the idea of the multiverse and the idea of superposition for a quantum particle is because it brings up this idea of infinite potentiality. So if the mind can think of anything, at least theoretically, if the mind can think of anything, then what can it do? Well, essentially it can do whatever it wants. And that is, of course, assuming that it has the ideas at its disposal, that it has the creativity, that it has the capability. But the point is we're assuming that it does have the ability. And so I'll admit in my own understanding of infinite potentiality, I definitely see a lot of limitations. So just because you can conceive of a lot of different things, such as you can conceive in your mind the idea that you're flying, that's great, except that we obviously know that we can't fly. But that doesn't mean that we can't conceive of that idea in our mind. And I think that what we do with that idea is where the power is. And I think that that's why I think of this idea of infinite potentiality. And so not every idea that we have has to have some kind of practical bearing on the world. And I think that that's what we fall prey to. We lose track of our imagination. we lose track of our creativity, and we think that everything has to have some kind of practical role. Every thought that we have has to have some kind of practical role, and I think that's the mistake. And so simply by entertaining the idea of infinite potentiality for the mind, we at the very least open our mind to all of the possibilities that exist and all of the things that we could do potentially if we open our minds to it. And so again, just to be clear, the reason why I bring up the multiverse and quantum mechanics in this conversation is because I do think that the mind has a lot of possibilities with what it can do. I think it has a lot of potential. It's just a matter of tapping into that potential and figuring out what the mind can do. And so if the mind has this this ability to think whatever it wants, assuming that we believe that it has this ability to think of anything that it wants, and all of these things, and the physical world on both the large macro level and the micro level has this potential to exist in these infinite sets and infinite potentialities, then why can't the mind? And the trick is to figure out how to use the infinite potentialities of our mind and the infinite potential of our mind to shape reality. And I think that's the trick. In my own experience, I found it to be very difficult. Just real fast, I've been thinking a lot about how all of these abstract notions of the multiverse and the philosophy of emergence and the themes of postmodern literature, they're very fascinating, but they exist in such an abstract realm that I almost feel like they're divorced from the practical world, and I almost wonder sometimes if the only thing that matters is where I'm at physically, not my thoughts. So all that matters right now is that I'm sitting here recording a video and talking, and that's all that matters. But I think that's a mistake, and I think that what we need to do is try to figure out how to merge the physical world and our actions and the actions we could potentially do with these infinite potentialities that exist in our mind, and that exist just like the multiverse and just like the superposition of the quantum particle. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and it's something to think about. As I've kind of implied before, there are a lot of tricks because it's hard to, again, let those two elements of the abstractions and our physical, boring world match. But I think that it's possible if we give it a lot of thought. So I know my voice was scratchy. I don't know what happened. Sometimes it does that. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this talk. And again, just try to think of your creativity and everything that it can accomplish if you let your mind expand and open to all of the possibilities. Because assuming the multiverse exists and assuming that quantum mechanics is real about and accurate about its idea of superposition, it shows that at least certain levels of existence can exist on several possibilities or even infinite possibilities. And my question is, why can't the mind do that? Again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.